says, who then will harm you if you are devoted to what is good? What he's making is a really common point, a natural point that we're going to actually bring to the spiritual. And the common point is this. On a real practical level, if you just live a decent life, if you stay away from trouble, I'll use some common examples. If you're not dealing drugs, and if you're not using drugs, and if you're not consumed by chemicals and alcohol and all kind of immorality, the chances of tragedy actually happening to you, while they're not zero, they're actually pretty low. Have you ever thought about that? Just on a natural level, if you took all of the implications of drugs and alcohol and all the sexual immorality and all the basic things we know that are wrong, if you take those out of life, this is a real practical level, that while the chances of you not having tragedy or bad things happen in your life, it's not zero, but it's actually pretty low. Do you know that the majority of all the murders, just specifically in the U.S., usually are tied somehow to drugs or alcohol? And I'm not just picking, this is not a message about drugs or alcohol. I'm just using the point that when you're living a decent life, not many people are, you're not going to have those issues. You're not going to have to worry about getting murdered, somebody over your back all the time. There is occasion those things happen. But here's what he's telling us. When we're devoted, when we're zealous, when we're passionate about for what is good, first natural, but ultimately with God, the reality of people that are going to hurt you from a person, an individual, or even the government, it's actually very low, and it's actually going to be rare that it happens. It does happen. And we know there are Christians around the world that are dying for their faith because they say, hey, Jesus is Lord, and nobody else is, and so they're paying the price for that. So that does happen. But what Peter is talking about here, two believers in what we know of as modern-day Turkey now, that he was enduring and the persecution was turning up in Rome. And he was writing to these churches in modern-day Turkey. He said, hey, persecution's here, man. And we know that Peter died for his faith. He was crucified upside down probably just a couple of years after this letter was written. But he's saying, hey, if bad times come, if suffering comes, I'm going to show you how to walk through it according to how God wants. But in the process, if you're living the right way, practically speaking, there's not a huge probability that bad things are going to naturally happen to you, while it can happen. And he tells us that who will harm you if you are devoted or passionate to what is good. But then he says, for the small percentage, that even if you do suffer for righteousness, in America, there is bias and prejudice against those who truly follow Christ. That's obvious and seen. Thankfully, we're still in a country where outright persecution of followers of Christ is not the norm, and it's not physical, and it's not to the point of many other countries. But he says, even if you suffer for righteousness, for following Jesus, for truly being righteous, he says you're actually blessed. Now, that doesn't mean you're happy, because none of us, once again, enjoy tragedy. None of us enjoy persecution coming against us. But if bad things happen to us directly for following Jesus, here's what he says with that word blessed. While it may not be emotionally happy, there's a privilege and there's an honor there. Jesus talked about that in Matthew chapter 5. That blessed are you, what, if you're persecuted for righteousness? That if that happens, there's an honor and a privilege. Not many of us in this room will have to deal with that. You may in your job, because you stand for Christ, it may cost you a promotion. It may cost you your job and those type of things. And that is a big deal. I've walked with a number of people and families, even in recent years, that, man, it has cost them promotions. It's cost them jobs because they couldn't compromise on what was right versus what was wrong. And so that happens. But even if you are persecuted, if something bad happens to you directly for following Jesus, Jesus says you're blessed, you're honored, you're privileged, and there's treasure in store for you in heaven, no matter how bad it may be here on earth.